Imagine being in your village when mythological beings emerge from the ocean, pale bearded men covered in metal, with weapons that spit fire and death. This isn't fiction, this is Brazil. 1500. In less than a generation, 95% of your people will be dead, not by swords or arquebuses, but by invisible microscopic demons against which your shamans have no defense. And if you think the Portuguese were luckier, you're mistaken. Sailing for 4 months in floating coffins, where the rotten water mixed with feces, eating lava-infested biscuits, watching companions die of scurvy, their bodies thrown overboard like garbage. This is the true story of the glorious discovery that your schoolbooks omitted. And for you, 20th century Brazilian, wouldn't you last a single day on either side of this fatal encounter? But before understanding how both sides of this encounter were doomed, we need to understand what these two worlds were like, which should never have met. Forget everything you were taught in school about indigenous people and heroic Portuguese. The truth is much more complex and brutal. Brazil in 1500 was not an untouched paradise inhabited by primitive tribes. It was a sophisticated mosaic of indigenous nations with more than one distinct language, some as distinct from each other as Portuguese is from Mandarin. The coastal Tupinamba who welcomed Cabral were just one of hundreds of civilizations, each with its own history, art, medicine, and yes, wars. Indigenous cities in the Amazon were home to up to 10,000 people, connected by elevated roads that crisscrossed the forest. Meanwhile, Lisbon had only 65 inhabitants, many living in worse conditions than the savages they claimed to have come to civilize. An average Portuguese person in 1500 was illiterate and never bathed. The church considered bathing immoral. They believed in witches and lived surrounded by feces, both human and animal, in streets without sanitation. Their life expectancy was 30 years, if they were extraordinarily lucky. Meanwhile, the Tupinamba bathed daily, had perfectly healthy teeth thanks to a sugar-free diet, and practiced hygiene that Europeans considered bizarre. The disease-free life expectancy of indigenous Europeans easily surpassed that of the Portuguese. The indigenous diet, diverse, rich in protein, complex carbohydrates, and vitamins, cassava, corn, sweet potatoes, dozens of fruits, hunting and fishing, the Portuguese diet at the time. Moldy bread, salted meat that was often rotten, and vegetables scarce, almost everyone with chronic nutritional deficiencies. Portugal, far from being a powerful empire, was a small bankrupt kingdom in the shadow of Spain, placing all its chips on a desperate gamble, finding a sea route to the riches of the Indies. Brazil was a blip along the way, a consolation prize that initially disappointed. No gold in sight, no spices, only wild animals and trees. Calvin Tupinamba, a 25-year-old warrior, saw the floating houses wash ashore in April 1500. His ancestors had predicted the arrival of strangers from the sea for generations, not through mystical prophecy, but because fishermen occasionally sighted European ships that had been far from shore for decades. To him, the Portuguese were not gods, but simply another tribe, strange and potentially useful as an ally against traditional enemies. Manuel da Costa, a 14-year-old cabin boy on Cabral's Null, saw the Brazilian coast after 44 days of torment at sea. A forcibly recruited orphan, he had already seen 3 companions die and be thrown into the ocean like garbage. For him, that beach didn't represent glory. It represented the chance to survive another day. Both worlds were already transforming even before they met. The Inca Empire was expanding its influence across the continent. Severe droughts were altering indigenous migration patterns. In Europe, the Renaissance was beginning to question old certainties, while the Protestant Reformation was about to tear apart the continent's religious fabric. It was at this precise moment, in this delicate balance of civilizations in flux, that the clash occurred that would redefine both worlds forever. And the first flush of this encounter occurred not on the beaches of Brazil, but months earlier. On the very route here, a maritime torment that would drive any modern person mad within days. This maritime torment began long before sighting the Brazilian coast. Your first ordeal wouldn't even be setting foot in Brazil. It would be getting there alive. The glorious voyages that your history books romanticize were, in reality, one of the most horrifying experiences a human being could endure. Imagine being confined for 4 months in a space smaller than a modern bathroom, shared with 60 unwashed men, in a floating coffin tossed by 15-meter waves. The smell on board was so unbearable that novice sailors vomited for days until their sense of smell finally desensitized. A mixture of human sweat, dried feces, rotting wood, spoiled food, and the distinctive odor of death. The drinking water stored in wooden barrels turned into a green, viscous soup. After a few weeks, algae grew inside the vats. Worms swam freely in the liquid. The crew drank with their noses closed, filtering foreign bodies through their teeth. When the water ran out, they drank their own urine. The lucky ones died quickly of dehydration. The rest survived long enough to experience the true horror: scurvy. This disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, turned otherwise robust men into walking corpses in a matter of weeks. First, crusty patches appeared on the skin like unexplained bruises. Then the gums swelled until they completely covered the teeth, bleeding at the slightest touch. The breath became so putrid that one could smell a scurvy sufferer from meters away. Open wounds would spontaneously recur, refusing to heal. Teeth would fall out during meals, and bones that had already healed would break again. João Lopes, a gunner in Cabral's fleet, documented in his diary, "Yesterday we lost the cook. His gums grew so large that he could no longer close his mouth. He choked to death on his own blood. We threw ourselves overboard at dawn, the 23rd day from Lisbon. The sharks are already following us like faithful dogs." The food on board was torture in itself. Rock-hard biscuits, often infested with weevils, which the sailors ate along with them. Extra meat, they said in despair. Salted meat, so preserved in salt that it had to be dipped in seawater to make it even slightly chewable. Rats were considered delicacies. Fresh protein fought over by the officers. The hierarchy on board was as brutal as the environment. Floggings occurred almost daily for minor infractions. Talking during prayer could result in 20 lashes, stealing food 50 lashes, and branding with a hot iron. The cabin boys between 8 and 15 years old, many orphans forcibly recruited, they suffered the worst. In addition to physical abuse, they were constant victims of sexual violence, so normalized that it was rarely mentioned in official records. The work routine included 4-hour shifts, 4 hours off, indefinitely for months with no days off, no breaks during storms. Their fingers bled from pulling rough ropes. Their skin cracked from the salt, their eyes burned constantly. Sleeping meant huddling on the unventilated lower deck, in a space where you couldn't even stretch your legs. Diseases spread like wildfire. A simple cold could decimate half the crew in a week. Dysentery was so common that many sailors simply tied ropes to their waists and hung their buttocks overboard, suffering from constant diarrhea until they died. The statistics were brutal. Of every 100 men who set sail from Lisbon on the first voyages to Brazil, about 30 would never see land again. Of the 70 survivors, half would suffer permanent scars, lost, partially blind, neurological damage from scurvy. When these survivors finally sighted the Brazilian coast, it wasn't triumph they felt, it was desperate relief. When they fell to their knees in the sand, it wasn't just to thank God, it was because their bodies were literally falling apart after months of extreme deprivation. And it was in this state, sick, traumatized, desperate, that the discoverers found a healthy, well-fed people, utterly unprepared for the invisible horror that had just reached their shores. And it was thus upon these shattered Europeans that the true conqueror of Brazil silently disembarked. He carried no sword, no cross, no flag. He was invisible, microscopic, and more lethal than any weapon ever forged by man. The European virus. While Cabral and his men exchanged gifts with the Tupinambas, mirrors and beads for parrots and cassava, something far more valuable and deadly was being exchanged. A simple sneeze, a drop of saliva, perhaps the sweat of a feverish sailor, was enough to unleash the greatest genocide in American history. The indigenous immune system had never encountered diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, or tuberculosis. To Europeans, these were familiar illnesses they had lived with for millennia. To the natives, it was as if aliens had unleashed unknown biological weapons. Measles, which for a Portuguese child meant a few weeks of discomfort, decimated entire villages. Smallpox, even more terrifying, killed in ways that seemed straight out of nightmares. Consider the account of Bartolomeu, a Jesuit who witnessed the first outbreak of smallpox in a Tupinamba village in 1562. It began with high fevers that no shaman's herbs could calm. Then, fiery red pustules appeared all over the body, growing until they burst. oozing a yellowish fluid that stank like rotting flesh. Faces were distorted beyond human recognition. Children didn't recognize their mothers, whose faces had transformed into grotesque masks. I saw a mother, delirious with fever, would eat the flesh from her own arm before succumbing. The speed of contagion was terrifying. A healthy village in the morning could be dying by nightfall. The disease often traveled faster than the Europeans themselves. Villages that had never seen a Portuguese were already infected through contact with other tribes that had encountered colonizers. Piraju, chief of a village of 2,000 people near what is now Bertioga, saw his entire community disappear in 3 weeks. In the morning we buried 10. In the afternoon another 20 until there was no one left with the strength to dig. The bodies rotted inside the huts. Starving dogs began to feed on the dead. In the end I wandered alone among the huts, conversing with the spirits of the departed. Indigenous medicine, sophisticated in dealing with snake venom, fractures and war wounds, was completely powerless against these invisible invaders. The desperate shamans attempted increasingly extreme rituals, often infecting themselves in the process. The Portuguese, witnessing this apocalypse, interpreted it as divine punishment for the pagans or God's cleansing of the land for the Christians. Some missionaries genuinely tried to help, but their medicine, bloodletting, purging and prayer, often hastened deaths. The statistics are so terrifying they border on incomprehensible. It is estimated that there were between 3 and 5 million indigenous people in the territory that is now Brazil in 1500. A century later, fewer than 300,000 remained, a population reduction of over 90%. To put it in perspective, it would be as if 190 million Brazilians died in 100 years today, leaving only the inhabitants of São Paulo, the capital. In certain regions, entire populations disappeared without a trace, beyond broken pottery and marks of ancient fields in the forest. Languages that had existed for millennia were silenced forever. Medicinal, astronomical and botanical knowledge, accumulated over hundreds of generations, vanished in a single event. Generation. Some tribes, witnessing the seemingly supernatural destructive power of the Europeans, developed crisis cults, religious movements that blended Christian elements with native traditions in the desperate hope of surviving the apocalypse. Shamans preached the abandonment of villages and flight to mythical lands without evil, a paradise where they would be safe from the white man's diseases. For the few survivors, the psychological trauma was as devastating as the physical. How could they understand a world where their gods seemed powerless, where their traditions offered no protection, where entire families disappeared, leaving only silence? And while indigenous people died by the thousands, invisible in official records, the Portuguese consolidated their presence, transforming traumatized survivors into labor for a new and brutal economic system. For the few indigenous people who survived the microbial apocalypse, the true hell was just beginning. With ghost villages, abandoned fields, and shattered kinship networks, the survivors now faced a threat that not even their wisest ancestors could have foreseen: the complete re-engineering their existence. The Portuguese didn't just want the land, they wanted to transform the very concept of life. For a Tupinamba, work had clear limits. One hunted enough to eat, planted what was necessary for the village, and fished until hunger was satisfied. To work beyond that would be incomprehensible madness. Free time was dedicated to rituals, stories, preparation for war, activities that gave meaning to existence. For the European, this logic was savage laziness. The Portuguese concept of work was a biblical curse, an endless burden, perpetual accumulation. Time is money, said a nascent mentality that seemed insanity to the natives. Japara, a 19-year-old Tupiniquim, described his first week cutting Brazil wood. Before I hunted for 3-4 hours, got food for 2-3 days. Now I cut trees from dawn until I can't see anymore. So I carry trunks until my back bleeds, and in the end, I earn a handful of flour that barely feeds my children for a day. The transition was brutal. From landowners to serfs on the land, from hunters and independent farmers to slaves in an incomprehensible system. The Portuguese initially attempted to formally enslave the indigenous people. Capture expeditions, human hunts penetrated the interior, capturing any natives they encountered. João Ramalho, one of the first Portuguese exiles, who married the daughter of a chief, wrote in 1553, "I saw men who were once free as the wind, being chained and forced to carry logs until they fainted. Those who resisted had their hands cut off. Those who fled when recaptured had their tendons cut. Indigenous resistance was immediate and creative. Many simply fled inland. Others practiced passive resistance. They pretended not to understand orders. They purposely broke tools, worked with studied slowness. Some poisoned their captors with plants known only to them. Most, however, simply died of exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease, or pure existential heartbreak. Hunger, previously unknown in such abundant lands, became a constant companion. Traditional farms abandoned due to deaths or forced relocation ceased to produce. Game driven away by European presence and habitat destruction dwindled. Rivers, once abundant, no longer supported entire communities. In the Vaste Camino, he had written that in this land, if you plant anything, it grows. What he didn't foresee was that by destroying ancient food systems, everything would be in short supply. Ironically, the Portuguese also starved, unable to understand the natural cycles of the land they invaded. An anonymous record from a warehouse in São Vicente, 1552, reveals the colonists only avoided starvation because the few remaining Indians still bring cassava and game. The same savages we enslaved keep us alive with their knowledge, which we despise. For indigenous children born into this new world, the tragedy was even more profound. Orphaned of culture, they grew up without knowing who they truly were. In Jesuit retreats, they were forbidden to speak their native languages, to practice rituals, to hear the stories of their ancestors. As Father Manuel de Nóbrega wrote, these children are like virgins, ready to receive whatever form we choose to give them. Some entire communities simply disappeared, not only physically but culturally. Languages that had existed for millennia became extinct without leaving any record, other than a few words written down by curious Jesuits. Botanical, astronomical, and medicinal knowledge accumulated over hundreds of generations vanished without a trace. In just 50 years after discovery, the Brazilian coast, once dotted with thousands of villages, had become a foreign land for its original inhabitants. The survivors, traumatized by disease and slavery, now lived in an unrecognizable world, governed by incomprehensible rules, serving strange gods, working themselves to death for objects worthless in their traditional system. And while this was happening, the Portuguese themselves were facing their own tropical hell, discovering that conquering a paradise often meant transforming it into something very similar to the hell they left behind. While the indigenous people suffered under the yoke of the new order, it would be easy to imagine the Portuguese as triumphant conquerors enjoying their tropical paradise. The reality was brutally different. The paradise Caminha described in his letter quickly turned into purgatory for both sides. No one was winning, just surviving. The first Portuguese to truly colonize Brazil hadn't even chosen to be here. They were the exiles, criminals, heretics, forcibly converted Jews, and other undesirables were cast ashore like disposable human waste, convicted of crimes like blasphemy, sodomy, or simply for being poor in the wrong place. These men, and occasionally women, were the true pioneers, sacrificial meat to test the land's habitability. Afonso Ribeiro, a Lisbon thief sentenced to exile in 1500, was one of the first Europeans abandoned in Brazil. His fragmented diary reveals, "I passed from the king's prison to the jungle prison. The savages feed me, but I see in their eyes that I am a ghost to them. At night I cry like a child, knowing that I will die without ever seeing again the streets of Lisbon that I hated so much, but which now seem like a lost heaven." Of every 10 Portuguese who survived the Atlantic crossing, 7 died within the first 5 years in Brazil. The unbearable heat, the humidity that rotted everything, clothes, weapons, food, even morale, tropical diseases their bodies had never encountered before. Malaria, yellow fever, leiomyosarcoma, parasites that penetrated the skin of their feet, gigantic intestinal worms, insects that turned small wounds into devastating infections. The Atlantic forest, initially seen as an infinite source of riches, revealed itself to be a deadly labyrinth. Entire expeditions disappeared without a trace. Men went mad with fear, lost for weeks, drinking their own urine, eating poisonous roots through ignorance, dying just a few kilometers from settlements. Per Correa, in a 1551 letter to the Jesuit provincial, "The jungle swallows men like the sea swallows ships. 15 leave, 3 return. Mosquitoes are worse than any beast. They suck blood day and night without rest. I saw strong men go mad, tearing off their own skin, convinced that worms were growing beneath it. Loneliness was possibly the worst torment. Portuguese wrote desperate letters that took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. They begged for news, medicine, priests, Portuguese women, any connection with the world they had left behind. Diogo Alvares, the legendary Caramuru, wrote, "My children speak a language I do not fully understand. My wife, though devout and baptized, still consults the shamans when she is sick. I am a foreigner in both worlds now." Even the successful Portuguese lived in conditions that would have been considered miserable in Europe. They lived in mud brick houses, improvised furniture, eating with their hands for lack of cutlery, and wearing clothes patched together until they fell apart. Plantation owners who boasted of owning dozens of slaves often slept in indigenous hammocks for lack of beds, and treated wounds with tupi herbs for lack of European doctors. The introduction of new actors further complicated this brutal scenario. Enslaved Africans brought from 1550 onward encountered a different but equally inescapable hell. Torn from their lands, separated from their families and forced to work themselves to death, their life expectancy on plantations rarely exceeded 7 years. Their agricultural, metallurgical, and cultural knowledge, however, would profoundly transform the colony, creating cultural syntheses neither side could have foreseen. Conflicts between indigenous peoples, initially limited and ritualized, turned into wars of extermination when European weapons and alliances with colonizers entered the equation. Tribes allied with the Portuguese gained temporarily, only to discover they would be the next victims when their usefulness ended. In Ilus in 1556, a Tupinamba revolt decimated an entire plantation. Portuguese retaliation was merciless. Entire villages were burned, women and children sold into slavery, warriors impaled as a warning. The cycle of violence escalated steadily, creating wounds that would never heal. Not even the church escaped this tropical purgatory. Jesuit priests sent to save souls often succumbed to malaria before converting a single savage. Others broke vows of chastity with indigenous people, creating secret families. Some went mad with isolation, wandering the jungle in mystical delusions. In this apocalyptic scenario, where no one truly won, something unexpected began to emerge from the ashes of the colliding worlds. A new hybrid identity, born of shared trauma. Something that was no longer Portuguese, nor indigenous, nor African, but a unique synthesis that centuries later would be called simply Brazilian. And it was from this clash of destroyed worlds, from this shared purgatory, that something unexpected began to be born. From the trauma emerged a third path, neither Portuguese, nor indigenous, nor African, but a unique synthesis that against all odds survived and flourished. Brazil as we know it today was not discovered in 1500. It was forged in the blood, sweat, and tears of the following centuries. Observe the small silent revolutions that occurred. The Portuguese, who initially despised indigenous savagery, soon slept in hammocks, ate cassava, bathed daily, and adopted Tupi words. The Portuguese spoken in Brazil quickly divorced its Lusitanian origins, incorporating thousands of indigenous terms for plants, animals, and geographies that did not exist in Europe. Ipanema, Tijuca, Pindamonhangaba. The map of Brazil is a Tupinamba document written in the Latin alphabet. Ferro de Magalhães Gandavo wrote in 1576, "The oldest settlers are no longer truly Portuguese. Their children born in this land speak with a different accent. They use herbs their parents feared, and many, although they publicly deny it, consult shamans in secret when they fall ill." European medicine, powerless against tropical diseases, gradually incorporated indigenous knowledge of herbs, treatments, and diets. Portuguese agriculture, unsuited to the Brazilian climate, adopted indigenous planting and harvesting techniques. Even the supposedly inflexible Catholic religion developed unique syncretic forms, incorporating indigenous and later African elements. Indigenous survivors, in turn, adapted to the new imposed world. They learned to navigate the Portuguese legal system, using petitions and strategic alliances to protect what remained of their lands. They adopted European tools, domesticated animals, and techniques that strengthened their communities. Many converted to Catholicism, not out of theological conviction, but as a cultural survival strategy, preserving ancestral beliefs under a Christian veneer. Hiraimirim, baptized as Antonio and educated by Jesuits in the 17th century, wrote in fluent Portuguese, I pray to the God of the priests with my mouth, but my heart still hears the ancient spirits of the forest. I use their words to defend what remains of the world of my grandparents. Enslaved Africans, the third pillar of this traumatic foundation, transformed the colony with metallurgical technologies superior to the Portuguese. Innovative agricultural techniques and sophisticated philosophical and religious systems that survived brutal oppression. Brazilian cuisine, music, language, and spirituality are unthinkable without this fundamental contribution, forcibly torn from their homelands. The Achás gave birth to forms of resistance that permanently shaped national identity. Quilombos established alternative societies, some surviving to this day. Capoeira transformed movement into resistance. Religions preserved entire cosmologies, encoded in rituals and songs. This traumatic encounter created something unique in the world, a country that still struggles to understand its own identity. Brazil is both the executioner and the victim of its own history. We carry the DNA of those who conquered and those who were conquered, of those who enslaved and those who were enslaved. This fundamental duality explains both our greatest virtues and our most persistent demons. The abysmal inequality that defines contemporary Brazil has its roots in that April of 1500. The endemic violence, the predatory relationship with the environment, the contempt for indigenous peoples all echo the initial encounter, but also our extraordinary capacity for adaptation, our creativity in the face of scarcity, our ability to synthesize diverse influences into unique cultural expressions. Anthropologist Dark Ribeiro wrote, "Brazil was born of encounter, of miscegenation, of conflict. For this very reason, it is destined for creativity, the development of a new, syncretic and tropical civilization." The true lesson of discovery is not about simplistic conquest or victimization. It is about how history is made of encounters that transform both sides, often in ways no one could have foreseen. It's about how from the ashes of destruction, new identities can emerge, carrying both the wounds and the hopes of the worlds that preceded them. When you look in the mirror today, 5 centuries later, you see the aftermath of that fateful encounter on the beaches of Bahia. In your face, in your language, in your gestures, in the food you eat, in the stories you tell, in the beliefs you carry, whether consciously or not, lies the legacy of those who survived the apocalypse of 1500 and, somehow against all odds, built something new from the ruins of destroyed worlds. If this journey through the true origins of Brazil has moved you, if for a moment you felt the salty taste of the sea on the caravels, or the terror in the eyes of those who saw their world crumble, then you have just reconnected with a part of your own history that has been systematically erased from school textbooks. That thumbs up is not just a digital gesture. It is a small revolution against 5 centuries of sanitized history. This is you saying you're ready to face our origins without the filters of colonialist fantasy. And if you're not yet part of this community, subscribing to the channel is like participating in an ongoing archaeological expedition through the buried layers of our true history. In the comments, tell me what aspect of the discovery shocked you most. What did schools never tell you? This conversation is part of the decolonization of our own thinking, a process as necessary today as it was in 1500. And if you thought the founding of Brazil was brutal, the video now appearing on your screen will show you how maintaining this system required even more calculated horrors. The history of slavery that built this country isn't just about iron chains, but about how elites transformed skin color into destiny, and why we still feel that weight today. Share this video with that uncle who still believes in peaceful discovery, or with students who deserve more than the caramel version of our history. Learning about our origins is not just fascinating, it's revolutionary. After all, as historian Sergio Buarque de Holanda said, we are still exiles in our own land, until we finally know the truth about how we got here. Continue this journey with me, because the next stop promises to be even more revealing.